while the camera was off, Kim and I had been talking about the anti-chronological notion of these whole stories, and I've been encouraging him in this because real life doesn't unfold chronologically. So strap on your seatbelts low and tight across your hips, and we will wander some more.
All right, we'll keep wandering. So Ted and many of us had been playing around Chicago with this band that he called the Gold Coast Jazz Band. And basically it was Ted, and I always thought Bob Sundstrom was kind of the co-leader of it, because there were some personnel changes. We at one point had the blues piano player, Little Brother Montgomery, in the band. Drummer by the name of Booker T. Washington was in there. We had assorted string bass players. I can think of somebody named Rail Wilson. So that was it. And we played around. There were places to play, and we played them. But then when this thing with Phyllis Diller came up, they wanted, well, essentially what they wanted was an all-white band is basically what it was. And so that meant no Little Brother or Booker T or whoever the bass player was that we had at the time. So we went back to using these guys that, we all knew each other. So we took that band out, traveled around the Midwest, essentially. Well, we actually got as far east as Washington, D.C., come to think about it. Mostly we drove. John Cooper and I both had 59 Chevrolets that had giant trunks in them, so we could pack all of our stuff in those two cars. Phyllis Diller flew, and she was married to her husband Fang at the time. He took the train, and this was kind of, the passenger service was dwindling down even back then. This is about 64, I think. But he was on the train. He carried all our luggage on the train. And basically all we did, we'd play like 6 tunes, maybe 5 tunes. Then she'd come out. We'd get off the stage. She'd come out and give an hour's worth of stuff. Then we'd come back and play 5 more tunes. Then she'd come out and give another hour's worth of stuff. And that was it. And that band got to be pretty good, just playing that much. Well, they were all good players anyway. Some agent or another heard us somewhere and wanted us to start playing a series of hotels around the country. Well, certain members of the band didn't think we were good enough to do that, so that was the end of it wasn't the end of the band, but when the Phyllis Diller tour ended, that was the end of that band, actually taking on work that was available full time. So we all went back to Chicago. Peter Nygaard went back to Denmark for a while, which is where he was from. And some of us went back to playing with the Salty Dogs. At that point, Lou Green was the leader, and he had cut off the Purdue connection, although there was still a band down there at Purdue. So that's when Lou, I guess, decided we were the original Salty Dogs, which we weren't, but that's the name we used. And the guys at Purdue were the Salty Dogs. So that went on for a while. We played stuff here and there with that band. And it was, like different guys would get work and they'd call you. There was plenty of, there was work. I'm remembering now when Eddie Davis had this band, it was on Rush Street in Chicago, which was the entertainment street at the time. And there was about 4 other places within like 3 or 4 blocks there that had, well, we'll call them Dixieland bands. Here, George Brunis had a band at one place. I can't think of the names of the other guys, but they were all good bands, good musicians. They weren't necessarily known musicians, but they didn't need to be. They were comfortable having their job in their hometown. They didn't have to travel, this kind of stuff. So that was, of course, obviously a different era. And business wasn't necessarily that great in all these places either. But I have the feeling, and I can't be sure about this, that perhaps there was some gangsters involved here that owned these places, and if there was a some kind of big event in town, convention of some place would always be busy, and weekends they were always busy. So they managed, and they didn't care really. I think it was a good place to launder money. So we worked there. Then, for whatever reason, that job came to an end. There was another part of Chicago, by the way, called Old Town. They tried to turn that into an entertainment area, so they had several joints there. I never really played in any of those places on a regular basis, but I thought my piano playing career was over. I got a call from this guy who had a band in one of these Old Town places saying, "I need a piano player tonight. You got to come down and play." I said, "I can't play the piano. I never could." But he had just insisted that I come down there, and I thought, okay, I'm warning you in advance. I'm not good enough. He said, "That's all right. I got to have somebody." So I go down there, and it turns out that actually he is backing a show for STEPIN FETCHIT, I don't know how to describe STEPIN FETCHIT, but for those who don't know who he was.
The film comedian.
Okay,
right?
that's a good way. So STEPIN FETCHIT says, okay, we open up with Old Man River in the key of A flat. Well, first of all, I couldn't play the piano in A flat worth a damn. And second of all, I really didn't know Old Man River that well anyway, so it was not a pleasant evening, and that was the end of my piano playing career. That was kind of a low point, I'll tell you. It was STEPIN FETCHIT wasn't happy. The band leader, well, he got his piano player, but I think he realized that I was telling him what I had told him was true, and I wasn't happy about it. But what the heck, I did it. Let's see here. So there were a couple of bands playing in that Old Town area. I didn't play in any of those on any regular basis, but occasionally as a substitute, I might go down with a horn that I could play as opposed to the piano. And during this time, of course, the Salty Dogs did have some work here and there now and then. But it was also coming to the point where that's when would that have been? Oh, probably the very early 70s that we moved over to Michigan. And that was my Michigan period. That's when I first was contacted by Gene Mayle. I was living over there. He called me up. I'd never met the guy. Didn't even know that he was still alive, but he had something over in Detroit. And Gene was amazing. He knew every musician in the country that played this kind of music. Because he could always put a band together, and usually they were pretty decent bands. So I got a call from him, and went over and played this thing in Detroit. George Brunis was on the band. I can't remember who else was. And that was the start of my career with Gene Mayle. He would call me for stuff, and I'd play it. And I got to thinking, it kept me fairly busy. And I thought, maybe I should just forget all this other stuff and concentrate on playing music. And that's kind of what I tried to do. My ex-wife and I were starting to decide to be exes at that point. So I thought, okay, I'll do that. I'll go back to Chicago. And I went back to Chicago, wound up playing at this Gaslight Club, which was kind of a hokey thing. They actually had like 3 of them. And I played the one out at O'Hare Field at the airport with this guy, Jack the Bear, trumpet player. Jack always said of himself, he said, people all think I'm great and the musicians all like me as a person. So he was not the world's greatest trumpet player, but he was a nice guy. He had played on Eddie Davis's band, and Eddie made him learn all these tunes. Jack, before Eddie made him do that, he had his entire repertoire listed on a piece of cardboard that you get back in your shirt if you took it to the laundry. The Bears, all his tunes were on this, in big writing too. But Eddie made him learn a lot of tunes. So the Bear somehow got this job out at the Gaslight Club, and it was a quartet. It was him. He hired me. He had BARRETT DEEMS playing drums, and Barrett, of course, fortunately for everybody, didn't drive. So the Bear would pick him up, bring him out, and Barrett would say, "Jack, you suck. You're terrible. You can't play." And that would be his ride out to O'Hare. Then we'd play the job, and Jack would have to take him home, and he'd say, "Jack, you're terrible. You're awful. You suck." But that was okay. Jack didn't care. I mean, it was a great job for him. Best job he ever had, in fact, because at that time, leaders, this was a union thing, leaders got double scale. And I think the scale out there was like $250 a week, if I'm not mistaken. So Jack the Bear is making $500 a week. And basically what he did, we'd play a tune, then these waitresses all were supposed to be able to sing. Well, some could, some couldn't, but it didn't matter that much. So he'd bring one of the waitresses up, they'd sing. And then he'd feature either me or the piano player. Then he'd bring another waitress up, she'd sing. Then he'd feature whichever one of us he hadn't featured already. Then he'd bring another waitress up, she'd sing. Then he'd come back up from the bar and we'd play one tune, and that would be a set. So the Bear, that was a great job. He loved it, and I could see why, and it was actually okay. So I did that for a while, but then I didn't really want to be tied down because I'd met Eileen at that point. She lived up in the Twin Cities. So I left there and let Gene Mayle know that I was available once again to play all kinds of stuff. So, actually before that, I'd promised Gene that I'd go to Alaska with him for 8 grueling weeks, which I did.
That's going to be its own story.
Well,
back in a
maybe so.
minute.